The autumn fog had rolled in early that evening, thick and slow, curling around the wooden fences and damp earth of Dunwich Hollow. St. Hildegard's convent stood in the distance, its dark roof and pale walls blurred by the mist, a quiet silhouette against the fading light. Inside, the nuns moved softly through their nightly routines, the sound of footsteps on old floorboards mingling with the faint rustle of habits in the still air. By nightfall, the village lay under a heavy silence, broken only by the muffled call of an owl somewhere in the trees. Then, without warning, the bell tower came alive. Its tolling cut through the fog, deep and resonant, shaking the cold air in slow, measured strokes. One after another, the bells rang, but there was no figure pulling the rope, no hand upon the chain. Windows in the village flared with lamplight as people stirred from their sleep. Doors opened, boots met the mud, and uneasy glances passed between neighbors. Some crossed themselves without thinking. Others muttered old warnings about the convent and the ground it stood on. By the time the first villagers reached the chapel, the bells had fallen silent. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was clear. Inside, the corridors glowed dim with candlelight, the walls cold to the touch. In the dormitory, 12 beds were neatly made, and in each lay a nun, still as stone. Their eyes were open, gazing upward, as though fixed on something no one else could see. Their faces were peaceful, lips almost curved into the ghost of a smile. There were no wounds, no signs of illness or struggle, no hint of what had stilled their hearts. A coroner would later say their bodies were in perfect health, as if life had simply stepped away, leaving everything else untouched. Some whispered that they had been taken, not by death, but by something older, something that knew how to leave no mark. In the days that followed, no one dared to climb the bell tower again. Even now, on certain nights when the fog hangs low over the fields, the sound of those bells seems to drift across the hollow, calling out to no one, and to something. Long before the night the bells rang, Dunwich Hollow was a place with a memory of its own. The land here seemed to hold on to things, not just in the soil but in the air, in the way the wind carried sounds farther than it should. The first settlers, stern-faced Puritans, came seeking farmland and solitude, yet even they wrote of strange cries in the dark, of shapes glimpsed moving in the fields when no one was there. Decades later, waves of Catholic immigrants arrived, bringing their own rituals, their own saints, their own shadows. The two worlds never settled easily beside each other. The convent, rising pale against the rolling acres of corn, became a symbol of division. Whispers followed its nuns through the narrow lanes, accusations that they sang in tongues not meant for church, that their candles stayed lit until dawn for reasons that had nothing to do with prayer. The town had already been marked by unexplained vanishings, 3 children gone from their beds without a trace, a farmhand found miles from home with no memory of how he had crossed the distance, and the drowning of Father Elijah Moore, who had been seen walking calmly into the black waters of the mill pond and never coming up again. Even in daylight, there was something about the place that pulled at the edges of a person's thoughts. At night, lantern light seemed to sink into the ground rather than shine upon it. Some said the land itself was blighted, not by God's judgment, but by something far older, something that had been here before the first footstep of a settler. Old maps marked the area as a place of avoidance for native tribes, a place where fire would not burn right, where game would not cross. And though the years brought new names and new hands to work the fields, the feeling never left. People learned to lower their voices when speaking of it, to keep certain thoughts tucked away. In time, the convent's tragedy would seem like an eruption of all these buried things, the past pressing forward through the thin skin of the present. And yet in the quiet years before, the signs were already there, waiting for someone to notice. The diary of Sister Mary Agnes was small and plain, bound in worn brown leather, its pages softened by years of careful handling. It was found on her nightstand the morning after the tragedy, lying open as if she had set it down only moments before her final breath. Most of her entries spoke of ordinary days, notes on prayer vigils, the tending of the garden, the weather, but the final pages were different. The handwriting shifted from its neat, deliberate strokes into a jagged scrawl, the ink darker in some places where the pen had pressed too hard. Her words came in fragments, as if she could not write quickly enough to match her thoughts. She wrote of visitors in the hallway, after the lamps had been put out. Not footsteps, but the sound of garments brushing against the walls, a slow, measured pacing that never seemed to come closer or move away. She spoke of voices beneath the floorboards, murmuring in a language she did not know, their tones low and almost pleading, yet without breath between them. She confessed she had begun to dread the chapel at night, that she sometimes felt a pressure in the air, as if the walls themselves were leaning inward. There were mentions of the other sisters exchanging glances she could not understand, of conversations that would stop the moment she entered a room. She wrote of waking to find her rosary laid out on the floor beside her bed, each bead separated, the cross turned upside down. Her thoughts grew erratic, darting between prayer and warning, her sentences breaking off mid-line before starting again with something unrelated. And then, the very last line, "He is in the hall again. We cannot keep him out any long." The sentence trailed off there, ink dragging into a thin, fading line across the page, as if her hand had been pulled away. There were no signs of struggle in her room, no overturned chair or scattered papers, nothing to suggest a violent interruption. But the air in that small space felt colder than the rest of the dormitory, as though the walls had absorbed the last moments of her fear. Those who read her words later would speak of an unease that stayed with them, a quiet certainty that whatever Sister Mary Agnes had seen that night, it had been real, and it had been waiting. From the outside, St. Hildegard's convent appeared simple, almost austere. Its whitewashed walls and narrow windows gave the impression of order, of sacred purpose. But once inside, that sense began to unravel. Investigators who walked its halls after the tragedy found the layout oddly inconsistent, as if the building had been shaped in pieces, each by a different hand. Certain corridors ended abruptly in blank plaster, the floorboards beneath them hollow, suggesting space beyond that should not have been there. Staircases climbed halfway to an upper floor before meeting a wall, their banisters cut short, their steps worn as if once used but long forgotten. Beneath the chapel, a door in the vestry opened onto a narrow stone stair that descended into darkness. The tunnels it led to were older than the convent itself, their walls rough-hewn and damp, the air thick with a smell like cold earth after rain. Carved into the stone were marks that no one could translate, sharp, looping lines that seemed less like writing than something made to be remembered by touch. Local records hinted that the original structure had been built over the remains of a frontier trading post, though others whispered it stood on land once used for burial, a place deliberately left untouched until the church claimed it. The floor plans kept by the convent did not match what was found. Rooms marked as storage were instead bricked up, and spaces listed as empty contained furniture arranged as if someone had left in the middle of living there. In certain chambers, the temperature dropped without reason, even on warm summer days. Candles there would sputter as if in a breeze, though the air remained still. Some investigators spoke quietly of a feeling that the building was watching them, guiding their steps toward dead ends, then forcing them to retrace their path through narrow, lightless halls. For the sisters who lived there, these walls had been their entire world, yet there were places within the convent none of them claimed to have entered. It was as if the structure itself kept secrets, spaces folded away from sight, waiting in the quiet for something or someone to find them again. He came to Dunwich Hollow on a cold afternoon, walking the muddy road that led to the convent with a black satchel in one hand and the collar of his coat pulled high against the wind. He introduced himself as Father Corbin, speaking softly, his eyes fixed not on the people he addressed, but somewhere just past them, as if distracted by something they could not see. He claimed he had been sent from the diocese to assist in spiritual matters, though he carried no letters of introduction, no official seal, nothing but his word. The Mother Superior welcomed him, as was the custom, yet even she seemed unsettled by his presence. The villagers noticed him in the evenings, wandering the convent grounds after dark, his figure moving slowly between the bare trees, stopping now and then to look back toward the chapel windows. Those who passed close enough swore they heard him speaking in low tones, as though in prayer, though the words were unfamiliar and broken by long pauses. Some nights he was seen standing in the bell tower, motionless, the wind tugging at the hem of his cassock. He spent hours in private conversation with the Mother Superior, the two of them seated close, their voices hushed. When asked later, she could not, or would not, say what they had discussed. After the night the bells rang, he was gone. No one had seen him leave, and no carriage had come or gone from the convent gates. In his small room, the investigators found only a leather-bound book, its cover darkened with age and worn smooth at the corners. Inside, the pages were filled with careful Latin script, accompanied by drawings that unsettled the eye, human anatomy rendered in detail, the curves of bone and muscle entwined with shapes resembling crosses, halos, and symbols older than any church. Some figures were crowned with thorns, others bent backward at impossible angles, their hands lifted toward shapes of light that did not seem entirely holy. The diocese denied knowing any man by his name, and no other parish claimed him. In time, Father Corbin became another whisper in the long chain of the convent's mysteries, a shadow that passed through quietly, leaving only questions and the uneasy thought that perhaps he had not come to serve, but to open a door no one knew was there. The air around the convent grew sharper with the season, the leaves curling inward on themselves, the wind carrying the smell of wood smoke and earth. Inside, the sisters ate less with each passing day. At first it was only the absence of meat, the simpler soups and bread. Then the portions grew smaller still, and soon a single meal was stretched thin enough to feed them twice. Their faces became pale, their hands cold to the touch, yet they spoke of it as a blessing, a sacrifice to draw nearer to God. Each night they gathered in the chapel for long vigils, kneeling until their knees ached, their voices murmuring prayers into the hours when most of the village slept. From outside, those prayers sometimes sounded different, drawn out, rising and falling like a chant. A few villagers said they saw candlelight flickering in patterns across the chapel walls, as if the flames themselves were moving in time with the words. Some believed the sisters were preparing themselves for a vision or for some holy trial. Others whispered it was no devotion at all, but a ritual meant to invite something in. The Mother Superior spoke little of the fast to outsiders, only that it had been undertaken for the good of the community. Yet no one could agree on whether it had been her idea or suggested by the visiting priest, whose presence seemed to grow heavier as the days wore on. Within the convent walls, hunger became a constant companion, sharpening the edges of thought, bending dreams into strange shapes. Some sisters began to speak of feeling watched even when alone, of a warmth that would suddenly rise in the cold stone halls, only to vanish a moment later. By the final week, their voices in the chapel were hoarse, yet they prayed longer, their eyes fixed upward as if waiting for a sign. Whether that sign ever came is unknown, but the fast ended not with a feast or relief, but with the stillness of 12 bodies lying untouched, as though whatever they had been calling to had answered. The night was cold enough to turn breath into smoke, the sky clear and wide over the dark fields. 2 farmhands, finishing their work late, lingered by the fence that bordered the convent's land. The moon was high, pale against the black, and its light caught movement among the rows of corn. At first they thought it was the sisters, perhaps gathering something for the next day. But these figures moved strangely, their robes trailing behind them without catching on the stalks, their steps too smooth, too silent, as if their feet never touched the ground at all. There were 6 of them, evenly spaced, heads bowed. One carried an object that caught the moonlight in a flash of silver before being hidden again beneath the folds of cloth. The men watched in silence, neither daring to call out. The figures disappeared deeper into the field, swallowed by the rows, yet no sound of movement followed. After a long moment, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint smell like burnt wood. The farmhands left quickly, their unease growing, but curiosity pulled them back at dawn. They found the corn trampled in a perfect circle, the earth inside it blackened as if by fire, though no embers remained. The edges were sharp, as though cut with a blade, and the soil was warm to the touch. No tracks led in or out. When they spoke of what they had seen, the story was met with laughter and the shake of a head. It was said they had been drinking, that they had mistaken shadows for spirits. In time the corn grew back, but the circle remained, faint but stubborn, visible in the soil no matter how many seasons passed. Years later, when a photographer documented the old convent grounds, the mark was still there, dark against the lighter earth, as if the land itself had refused to forget. It was found in the bottom of a drawer in the choir loft, tucked beneath stacks of familiar hymns. The paper was yellowed, its edges crumbling at the touch, the ink faded to the brown of dried leaves. At the top of the page, in looping script, was a title unfamiliar to the investigators, Cantus Obscurus. The melody line was jagged, the notes arranged in a way that felt almost wrong to the eye, as if the music leaned against itself. The lyrics were in Latin, but the words did not match any sanctioned text. Scholars later traced them to an obscure apocryphal fragment that spoke of angels born imperfect, their forms bent and their voices discordant, forever yearning to return to the light that had rejected them. The hymn had been banned by the Church more than a century earlier, not only for its source, but for what it was said to do. Accounts from long ago claimed that when sung in full, it stirred visions so vivid they would overwhelm the senses, faces in the rafters, shadows in the corners, light bending into shapes that should not exist. No one knew how a copy had found its way to St. Hildegard's, but in the final nights before the tragedy, some in the village swore they heard music drifting from the chapel long after the lamps had been extinguished. It was unlike the solemn hymns of Sunday worship. The tones seemed to slide against one another, voices rising in strange intervals that made the air feel heavier, pressing against the chest. One farmer claimed that as he passed the chapel on such a night, the sound seemed to come not from the windows, but from the walls themselves, as though the stone had learned to sing. Those who later entered the chapel described the faint echo of melody lingering in the air, as if the building remembered it. Whether the sisters knew the hymn's history is uncertain, but the presence of that page among their music suggests intention, not accident. And perhaps it was not only the villagers who heard it. Perhaps the sound traveled farther, to places where the wrong kind of listening is an invitation. The coroner's report read like something caught between science and nightmare. Each of the 12 bodies was examined in turn, and each was found to be in perfect condition. The skin was pale but unblemished, the muscles supple, the organs healthy. There were no signs of injury, no trace of illness, no poison in the blood. Even after days had passed, there was no stiffness in the limbs, no cooling of the flesh that should have come with death. Their eyes remained open, the irises bright and clear, reflecting light in a way that made them seem almost aware. Stranger still, by the second day, several of the sisters' fingernails had lengthened noticeably, and the hair along their temples and necks appeared thicker, as if time had moved forward for parts of them while the rest remained frozen. The coroner, a man with decades of experience, could offer no cause, writing only that the manner of death was unknown and beyond present understanding. In the years since, samples taken from the bodies have been lost or sealed away, and attempts at modern reanalysis of the surviving records have yielded nothing. No disease matches the symptoms, no toxin explains the preservation. It was as if their bodies had simply stopped in the middle of living, caught in a moment that refused to pass. Those who stood over them spoke later of a peculiar feeling, as though the sisters were not truly gone, but only waiting, eyes fixed on some point beyond the room, holding their breath for something unseen. The letter was found by accident, sealed in the narrow space behind a loose section of plaster in the chapel wall. It was folded many times over, the paper brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. The handwriting was delicate at first, each line carefully formed, but as the page went on, the script trembled and slanted, as though written in haste or with an unsteady hand. It was addressed to the Holy See, yet there was no record it had ever been sent. In it, Mother Superior Beatrice spoke in careful, measured language about a choice she had made, a decision she called the Pact. She wrote that Father Corbin had come to her with promises of blessing, of divine favor that would ensure the convent's survival through years of hardship. She admitted to agreeing, though she claimed she believed at the time it was only a special devotion, a way to deepen the sisters' bond to God. But as the days passed, her faith in that belief began to waver. She described strange occurrences in the halls, shadows that seemed to grow longer in the lamplight, an echo in the chapel that did not match the voices present, and a heaviness in the air during prayer that left her chest tight. She wrote of the sisters speaking less to one another, their eyes often fixed on corners or doorways where no one stood. The final paragraphs abandoned the formality of her earlier words. The ink was darker there, pressed deep into the paper, the lines hurried and uneven. She spoke of fear, of something she could not name without feeling it draw nearer. She wrote that the pact was not with heaven, and that she had been deceived. The last sentence was broken in two by a jagged dash, the words large and urgent, "Do not let him be called by name in this place again." After that, there was only the empty margin, as if she had run out of space or courage to say more. No one knows why she hid the letter instead of sending it. Perhaps she feared it would be intercepted, or that speaking further of what she had agreed to would bring it back. Whatever her reasons, the letter remained in the wall until long after the convent had fallen silent, a voice from the past still whispering its warning into the dark. The entrance was little more than a narrow door set into the vestry wall, its hinges rusted, its frame nearly swallowed by shadows. The stairs beyond were steep and uneven, carved from stone so worn that the edges had rounded with time. The air grew colder as the light from above faded, each step carrying the explorers deeper into the earth. The tunnel floor was damp, the walls close enough to brush with both hands, their surfaces etched with markings that no one could read. The lines looped and curled in patterns that seemed deliberate yet resisted translation. Older than Latin, older perhaps than the land's first written words. Along the walls, alcoves had been carved at regular intervals, each holding a single jar sealed with darkened wax. When one was opened, it was found to contain soil, black, dense, and faintly metallic in scent. No one could say why it had been kept there, or from where it had come. The deeper the passage ran, the heavier the air became, as if the tunnel had been holding its breath for centuries. At its very end, the space widened into a low chamber, and there stood a small altar of pale stone, its surface worn smooth by hands or time. The carvings on its face were simple, yet deeply unsettling, figures without eyes, their heads tilted back, their arms outstretched in gestures that were neither wholly welcoming nor wholly pleading. Archaeologists who later examined the site could not agree on its origin. Some saw the influence of indigenous craftsmanship, while others argued it belonged to something far older, a culture with no surviving name. When sound tests were done in the chamber, the results showed faint, persistent vibrations in the air, though no source could be found. Visitors who came after spoke of hearing whispers just at the edge of perception, a slow rhythmic murmur that rose and fell like chanting. Yet when they turned, the chamber was empty, and the only sound was their own breathing, uneven and quick in the stillness. Those who stayed too long described the sensation of being watched from very near, though the tunnel behind them was dark and silent. Whatever the altar had once been for, its purpose had been buried deep beneath the chapel floor, hidden in a place where the earth itself seemed unwilling to let go of what it had been made to hold. It began without warning, a sudden shift in the air that made the lamps in the village flicker. By nightfall, Clouds had gathered over the convent, though the rest of the county sky remained clear and starlit. The wind rose in a single sharp breath, carrying with it the smell of iron and wet stone. Witnesses on the road said they saw lightning fork across the sky above the chapel, bright enough to turn the fields white for an instant. Yet no thunder followed, only silence, deep and heavy, as if the world were holding still. Then the rain came. It was thin at first, a fine mist that clung to clothing and skin, but it thickened into a steady fall, coating the convent's windows in streaks that shimmered strangely in the lamplight. By morning, the glass was marked with a faint, oily film that resisted washing, leaving behind a distorted reflection of anything that stood before it. Some who were out that night swore they saw more than clouds in the sky. They spoke of shapes forming and shifting in the storm, pale faces emerging in the darkness above, eyes hollow, mouths stretched wide in a scream no one could hear. One farmer claimed he saw the tower bells sway, though no wind was touching them, and that in the same moment, a face in the clouds seemed to turn and look directly at him. The county records from that night are plain. No rainfall reported beyond the convent's grounds, no lightning strikes detected by any instruments. The storm had been confined entirely to that one place, appearing and vanishing within the span of a few hours. No explanation has ever satisfied the witnesses. For them, it was not simply weather but an event with intent, a gathering of forces that had chosen the convent and nowhere else. And when the clouds broke, and the first thin light of dawn touched the chapel roof, the bells rang once, not in a peal, but a single low toll that hung in the air long after the sound should have faded. The man had worked the convent grounds for most of his life, moving slowly but surely along the outer wall each night, trimming wicks, refilling oil, keeping the lanterns burning through the dark hours. He knew every creak of the gates, every shift in the wind across the fields. On the night of the tragedy, his route brought him near the chapel, just as the clock in the village struck 3. That was when he heard it, soft at first, then rising, a sound that did not belong in the stillness. Laughter, not the warm, quick laughter of joy, but something drawn out, layered, as if many voices were spilling into one another. It carried through the heavy wooden doors, curling out into the cold air. He moved closer, his lantern casting a trembling light across the threshold. Through a narrow gap between the doors, he peered inside. The pews were filled, every bench occupied by shadowed figures that swayed together in slow rhythm, their outlines unsteady, as if the candlelight could not decide what they were. They faced the altar, their heads slightly bowed, though not a single familiar face could be seen. The air inside seemed thick, moving in time with the shadow's motion. He searched for the sisters, but they were nowhere among the shapes. For a long moment, he could not breathe, his hand frozen on the doorframe. Then, without warning, the swaying stopped, and every head turned in unison toward where he stood. He stumbled back, his lantern swinging wildly, and when he looked again through the gap, the pews were empty. Not a sound remained, only the faint smell of extinguished candles drifting through the doorway. He told no one in authority, speaking only to a friend in the village, who urged him to write it down. But the account was never recorded in any official report. 2 weeks later, the lantern keeper failed to appear for his nightly rounds. His small room by the garden was found undisturbed, the bed neatly made, his tools in their place. He was never seen again. Those who knew his story wondered if the shadows had simply finished what they had started that night, claiming him as one of their own. They gathered the things in silence, carrying them from the convent in crates and sacks, rosaries, prayer books, habits, folded with care, the brittle sheets of music taken from the choir loft, and the leather-bound volume left behind in Father Corbin's small room. The church officials said it was necessary, that the only way to cleanse the place was to burn what had belonged to the dead. In the yard behind the chapel, they built a pyre, stacking wood high and dousing it with oil until the scent hung thick in the cold air. One by one, the objects were thrown onto the flames. Some burned quickly, curling into ash in moments, but others resisted. A hymn sheet would blacken at the edges, smoke curling from it in slow twisting lines, yet the paper itself would not catch. A wooden rosary, darkened beads cracking with sharp little pops, but the cord between them held fast, refusing to give way. Father Corbin's book was placed in the heart of the fire, and though its cover split with the heat, the pages inside only smoldered, turning a deep, unnatural red. The smoke from these stubborn things was unlike the rest, thick, acrid, with a sour edge that clung to the throat. Witnesses coughed and turned away, their eyes watering. One man swore the smoke carried shapes, faces that shifted and vanished in the air above the flames. Another claimed he heard whispers rising from the pyre, words spoken in a low, urgent rhythm. A few who stayed close to watch said they felt suddenly dizzy, the ground beneath them seeming to tilt, their vision swimming with flashes of places they had never seen. Stone corridors, a sky the color of rust, a doorless room lit only by a single candle. The fire was stoked again and again, oil poured heavy onto the wood, but still those few objects refused to be consumed. At last, the officials ordered them removed and buried in deep pits beyond the convent grounds. No marker was placed over them, and the earth there was left to settle on its own. Yet for days after, the wind seemed to carry a faint trace of that foul smoke, drifting into the village streets and through the open fields, as if the fire had not truly ended. The decision to move the graves came quietly, spoken of only in the back rooms of the parish house. The cemetery where the 12 nuns had been laid to rest was to be cleared for new construction, and their remains reburied on consecrated ground closer to the village. On a cold morning, half a century after the bells had rung, a small crew of workers gathered at the edge of the old plot. The markers were weathered and leaning, the names carved into them softened by time. Shovels bit into the frozen earth, the sound dull and steady in the still air. One by one, the coffins were brought to the surface, the wood darkened and brittle with age. Yet when the first lid was pried open, the men froze. Inside lay the body of Sister Mary Agnes, her face pale and unmarked, her habit as dark as the day she had worn it. Her hands were folded neatly over her chest, and her lips seemed to hold the faintest trace of a smile. There was no decay, no sign that 50 years had passed. The same was true for the next, and the next, each sister lying as though she had been placed there only hours before, their skin cool but firm, their hair smooth and unbroken by the years. Even the faint scent of incense still clung to their clothes. The workers spoke in low voices, crossing themselves before touching the coffins again. A priest present at the exhumation turned pale, his hands shaking as he closed each lid. Before the day was done, word had reached the church authorities, and an order came to reseal the graves immediately. The relocation was cancelled, the cemetery left to stand as it was, but not all evidence was hidden. One of the workers, unable to shake what he had seen, brought a small camera to the site the next morning. In the early light, he opened 2 coffins and took photographs. The images, though blurred at the edges, clearly show the serene faces of the nuns, their eyes closed now, their skin unbroken. Those photographs passed from hand to hand over the years, surfacing only in whispered circles. In them, the sisters do not appear dead at all, but merely sleeping, caught in a pause that time itself had been unable to break. To this day, no one knows why they remained untouched, or whether the earth that held them had refused to let them go. Sister Helena spoke slowly when the account was taken, her voice softened by age but steady in its conviction. She had been away on the night the bells rang, visiting her ailing mother in a nearby town. It was a grace she never asked for, but one she could not ignore. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, she said, the convent had changed. The air itself felt heavier, as though something unseen had settled over the halls. Silence grew in places where once there had been gentle conversation. The sisters avoided each other's eyes, their words clipped, their movements measured. At night, Helena began to hear faint sounds beneath her bed, not the scurrying of mice, but a slow, deliberate scratching, as if nails were tracing the underside of the wood. She told herself it was nothing, yet each night it came again, always at the same hour. Then there was the morning she awoke to find her rosary on the floor beside her. The beads were knotted into a pattern she did not recognize, the cross turned inward, the chain twisted so tightly she could not pull it apart. She brought it to the Mother Superior, who took it in her hands, frowned, and told her to pray with another. Helena felt eyes on her constantly after that, even in empty rooms. She recalled moments when the chapel seemed too quiet, the air too still, as though waiting for something to begin. She could not name the source of her unease, only that it deepened each day. When she returned from her visit, and learned of what had happened, she went to the dormitory where her sisters had been found. The beds were as they had been that night, the faint indentation of each body still pressed into the mattress. She stood there a long time before speaking, and when she did, her words were simple but cold enough to still the room. It was not death that came for them, she said. Death is merciful. This was something else. The leather-bound volume left behind in Father Corbin's room had sat for decades in the archives of the diocese, its contents unreadable to all but a handful of scholars. When at last it was examined in full, its pages revealed more than anyone had expected or wanted. The text was in Latin, but laced with older words that did not belong to any known tongue, their meanings guessed only through context. The book was not a single work but a strange weaving together of Catholic liturgy and rites far older, the prayers of the Mass interspersed with invocations to beings unnamed in Christian tradition. These beings were described as the unfallen, neither angels of heaven nor demons of hell, but something that had existed before such divisions. Some pages detailed ceremonies meant to bind them within sacred spaces, circles traced with oil and ash, chants spoken in alternating tongues, symbols carved deep into stone. The illustrations were precise and unsettling, floor plans of buildings that matched no known churches, their walls thickened and reinforced in specific places, their windows narrow and placed to control the path of light. One drawing bore an uncanny resemblance to St. Hildegard's convent, down to the peculiar angles of its hallways. The implication was clear. The convent had not been built solely for worship, but as a containment site. The final chapter shifted in tone, its careful script becoming denser, the ink pressed harder into the paper. It spoke of the breaking of the seal, of what would happen if the gate within such a place was opened. Those inside would not die in the ordinary sense. They would sleep without closing their eyes, caught in a state between breath and stillness, their bodies preserved, their awareness bound to something that had been waiting for release. The last page ended with a line that was not in Latin at all, but in the unknown language scattered throughout the text. Its sound, when spoken aloud, was said to leave a coldness in the room, as if the air itself had leaned closer to listen. Whether Father Corbin had come to strengthen the seal, or to break it, the book gave no answer, but its presence in his room, so close to the heart of the convent, suggested that whatever happened that night had been prepared for, step by careful step. The photograph was one of only a handful taken inside the convent in the days after the tragedy. It showed the chapel as it was then, empty pews, the altar draped in white cloth, candles unlit, the light from the high windows falling in thin, pale beams across the stone floor. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but in the background, just behind the altar rail, a shape stood where no one should have been. It was tall, its outline blurred by shadow, yet distinct enough to see the way it rose higher than any person could without stooping beneath the low arch. The head was narrow, the shoulders too sharp, and the arms seemed longer than they should have been, hanging close to its sides. When the photograph was taken, there had been no one in that position, at least no one the photographer or the witnesses could recall. At first it was dismissed as a trick of light, the pattern of shadow falling just so, but when the image was examined closely, the proportions did not match the walls or furniture behind it. The darkness of the figure was deeper than the surrounding shade, as if it absorbed the light rather than being shaped by it. Years later, digital scans revealed faint distortion along the edges of the silhouette, the kind caused when something moves slightly while the lens is open. Yet the rest of the image was perfectly still. Experts in photographic history found no signs of tampering, no double exposure, no flaw in the plate. The figure was there when the photograph was taken, whatever it was. Those who have studied the image in person speak of a strange feeling that comes over them, a tightening at the base of the neck, as if aware of being observed. Some claim that when viewed in dim light, the figure's head seems to tilt slightly, as though acknowledging the watcher. The original print is kept in a private collection now, away from public display, but copies still circulate quietly, passed between those who know the convent story. In every one, the shadow remains, fixed in its place, waiting behind the altar. They came without announcement. 3 men in long black cassocks, stepping down from a carriage that bore no crest or seal. The villagers watched from doorways as the strangers made their way to the convent, their eyes lowered, their expressions unreadable. Within an hour, the chapel doors were locked, and only a select few from the parish were allowed inside. No one saw the meetings that followed, but the air in the village grew tense, the streets quiet, except for the sound of the church bell marking the hours. The men worked methodically, removing items from the chapel under heavy cloth, statues, candlesticks, even sections of carved wood from the altar itself. Each piece was loaded into crates and carried away without explanation. Those who caught a glimpse said the men handled the objects with a careful distance, as if reluctant to touch them directly. On the 3rd day, the chapel was emptied entirely, the pews pushed aside to clear the floor. That night, long after sunset, the Vatican officials began a ritual seldom seen outside the walls of Rome. Candles ringed the altar space, their flames casting shadows that seemed to stretch higher than the walls. The men moved in precise patterns, chanting in a low, measured tone, sprinkling water that hissed faintly when it touched the stone. The sound carried faintly to those gathered beyond the locked doors, a rhythm that did not match any mass the villagers had heard before. By dawn, the men were gone. In their place, the chapel stood bare and cold, the air heavy with the scent of incense and something sharper, metallic. The official statement came days later, read aloud by the parish priest. It was, they said, a precautionary blessing, a measure taken to ensure peace and sanctity after so grievous a loss. But few believed it. To the people of Dunwich Hollow, it had been an act not of comfort, but of sealing, an attempt to contain something that had already touched the ground, to bind it before it could spread. And though the Vatican's men left without a trace, the feeling they carried with them seemed to linger, like a shadow that could not be swept from the floor. It happened on a windless night in the late summer of 1898. The moon was high, casting pale light over the empty fields, when the first glow appeared in the windows of the abandoned convent. At first it was mistaken for lamplight, perhaps trespassers exploring the long deserted halls. But then the glow deepened, shifting to a fierce molten orange, and the air filled with the dry crackle of wood catching flame. Villagers gathered at a distance, their silhouettes wavering in the heat that poured from the structure. Yet the fire did not behave as it should. The flames seemed to pull downward, sinking into the earth through the floorboards rather than climbing toward the roof. The windows pulsed with light like the slow beat of a heart. Those who stood close enough swore they felt a faint vibration beneath their feet, a steady hum that grew louder the longer they watched. It was not the roar of a burning building, but a low, resonant tone, as if the earth itself was speaking. No one approached to fight the fire. The heat was too great, and an unspoken fear kept them rooted in place. The blaze lasted less than an hour. When it ended, there was no smoldering ruin, no blackened beams jutting toward the sky. The convent was simply gone. The ground where it had stood baked hard and cracked, the soil beneath turned an unnatural shade of grey. Only the bell tower remained, its iron rusted, its stone scarred but unbroken. It stood alone in the silence, casting a long shadow across the scorched ground. In the days that followed, there was no investigation, no search for the cause. Some said the fire had been set on purpose, a final act to erase what the walls had once held. Others believed it was no accident and no human hand that began it, but the last breath of something that had been bound there, sinking back into the earth from which it had come. Even now the tower stands, its steps crumbling, its bell long removed, yet on certain still nights, the air around it seems to carry that same deep hum, faint but steady, as if waiting for the sound to be recognized. The bell tower is all that remains now, rising alone from the empty ground where the convent once stood. Its stone is weathered and pitted, streaked dark from decades of rain. The steps inside are warped and uneven, the wood damp with the smell of rot. The bell itself is long gone, removed after the fire, yet on certain nights when the fog drapes low over the fields, people say they hear it toll. The sound is faint at first, almost like the shifting of wind through the tower, but then it deepens, rolling across the open land in slow, deliberate strokes. Those who have heard it describe a weight in the air when it comes, as if the sound presses against the chest, making it hard to draw breath. Paranormal investigators have been drawn to the site for years, bringing cameras, audio recorders and devices meant to measure the unseen. More than one has captured strange evidence, low, rhythmic chanting that seems to come from the base of the tower, though no one is there. The language is often unclear, but fragments in Latin have been identified, prayers mingled with phrases that do not match any known text. On one recording, a woman's voice can be heard, soft and urgent, calling a name over and over until it fades into static. Another captured the metallic rattle of the bell chain moving as if pulled, though the iron hook where it once hung has been bare for over a century. Visitors speak of a peculiar feeling that lingers after standing beneath the tower for too long. Some feel a subtle vibration in the soles of their feet, others a sensation like fingers brushing against the back of the neck. A few claim to have seen movement high above in the belfry, a shadow leaning outward to watch them, though when they look again, the space is empty. Locals have learned to keep their distance on foggy nights. They say the sound of the bell is not meant to be heard by the living, that each toll is a call, and answering it in any way invites what still stirs in the soil below. Yet the curious keep coming, drawn by the idea that the past is not gone at all, but waiting, patient and unblinking, in the tower that will not fall. On the nights when the fog swallows the fields and the air tastes faintly of metal, those who listen closely can hear it. The slow, mournful echo of a bell that no longer exists. The deeper the researchers dug into the archives, the less the story of St. Hildegard seemed like an isolated tragedy. In yellowed parish records from Italy, they found mention of a hilltop convent where 10 sisters were discovered lying peacefully in their beds, eyes open, their bodies untouched by decay. A faded newspaper clipping from rural France told of a monastery emptied overnight, every monk gone but one, mute and trembling, who would only write the words, "He came in through the chapel." In the mountains of Chile, oral histories spoke of a mission where the priests and novices alike were found kneeling in prayer, unbreathing, their hands clasped so tightly the bones had splintered beneath the skin. In each account, there was a common thread. Days or weeks before the deaths, a visitor had arrived, sometimes a priest, sometimes a traveler seeking shelter, sometimes a figure described only as the man in black. None were seen again after the tragedy. And in the aftermath, the pattern repeated, officials arriving quietly, relics removed, the site either abandoned, sealed behind stone, or destroyed by fire. Maps were drawn, and the locations formed no obvious connection, no path to follow. The incidents were scattered across centuries and continents, yet the details were too precise to ignore. The victims were always part of closed religious communities. The bodies were always found in perfect health, and there was always some sign of a presence that did not belong, a hymn not meant to be sung, a shadow where there should have been none, an object that would not burn. Some scholars argued these were legends, stories twisted over time. But others pointed to the consistency of the details, the strange precision of the deaths, and the swift, secretive interventions by church authorities. The more the pattern took shape, the clearer it became that whatever had visited St. Hildegard's had walked other halls before, and likely would again. For those who believe, the question is not whether it will return, but where, and whether the next set of walls will hold as long as the last. And for those who doubt, there remains the troubling truth that in every place where the pattern appears, the land is left hollow, the buildings stripped bare, as if the very stones had been taught to forget. Yet the silence that follows never feels empty. It feels like waiting. It emerged slowly, a single thread, woven through centuries of scattered records. The hymn found in the chapel carried it in its final verse, buried among the Latin phrases, a syllable that did not belong to any language. The leather-bound book repeated it again and again, tucked into the margins beside diagrams of walls and sealed doors. In the Vatican files, it appeared in hurried handwriting, usually followed by warnings or by heavy lines meant to blot it from sight. In every case, whether in Italy, France, Chile, or here in Ohio, the same arrangement of sounds surfaced, always near the heart of the mystery. At first, researchers believed it to be a name in some forgotten dialect, but the linguists disagreed. They said it was not a name at all, not in the human sense. It was a sound meant to imitate something older, something that had no true equivalent in speech. Its shape in the mouth was wrong, forcing the tongue into a position that left the throat raw. Its tone was neither high nor low, but seemed to vibrate somewhere deep in the chest, leaving the listener with the sensation that the sound had not ended even after it had. Those who attempted to speak it reported strange effects: an abrupt drop in the temperature of the room, a sense of being watched, or the faint impression that someone had whispered the sound back to them from just behind their shoulder. One archivist swore that as he read it aloud, the light in his office dimmed, though no clouds had passed over the sun. Another refused to continue his work entirely, sealing the notes and sending them away with a warning to leave the matter alone. The sound's purpose was never fully explained, but the documents suggest it was a call, a key, or perhaps an invitation. That it appeared in every known case was undeniable, and that those who survived had chosen never to repeat it was equally telling. In the end, the investigation had the name written clearly in the notes. The letters are there, the pronunciation transcribed, yet the voice telling this story will not shape it. Some things, once spoken, cannot be gathered back into silence. Some things do not wait to be called twice. So the sound remains on the page only, heavy and waiting, the space between the words thick with what it carries. And as you hear this, you may find yourself wondering, not what it means, but whether it already knows you have listened this far.